All right, everyone. Welcome to the second of our webinars here at the Military Aviation Museum. I'm Keegan Chetwynd, the director of the Military Aviation Museum, and it's my great pleasure to welcome tonight Chris Henry. Chris is the museum programs coordinator at the EAA Museum up in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. He's been with EAA for 7 years. He is an absolutely phenomenal resource when it comes to B-17 history. He's a well-respected member of the community of B-17 operators, historians, researchers. Chris was invited by the Air Force actually to speak at the National Museum of the United States Air Force when the Memphis Belle had completed its restoration and returned to the display floor. So pretty amazing opportunity that we have here this evening to hear from Chris. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Chris Henry, former air traffic controller, a medical helicopter dispatcher, and now published author. His book, The Final Mission, Personal Stories of the Lives Touched by EAA's B-17 Aluminum Overcast, just went on sale last week, I think, Chris. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, we just went on sale a week ago today.
Well, congratulations. I know you're going to tell us how you ended up kind of mixed up into the whole B-17 racket, so I won't spoil the surprise, but I will go ahead and turn it over to you to kind of take us on the journey.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you guys, and thank you everybody for having me. Thanks to Victoria as well for reaching out. I really appreciate it, and it's an honor to be virtually here and talking to you guys. So my name's Chris Henry. I've been working at EA for about 7 years. When I started out, I've been a B-17 nerd my whole life. Ever since I was a little kid, there was just something about that airplane. I first started volunteering at local air museum around 12 years old. I was actually working at the tail end of when 909 went through a restoration up in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, just outside of Pittsburgh. And then we had the movie Memphis Belle airplane there for a while, and then we did some work on Texas Raiders and Aluminum Overcast even. So I was really bit by the B-17 bug early on. When I got the chance to come work at EAA, of course, pretty excited. They had a flying B-17 that toured the country. My first job was in our member services area, and one of the things that I was always drawn to is when they found out I was a B-17 guy, they put me on the calls, people coming in and buying the ride. And there was one line that I always thought was missing, and I worked with our folks membership, and we added it onto the forms. And it was just, what made you want to buy this ride? To fly in a B-17, you're looking upwards of $400. So it's not a small amount of money to plop down to go for a flight that just takes you right back to where you left from. What makes you want to do that? And the reaction that we got on some of the people buying their tickets was truly awesome. And it was people who were writing in saying, well, my dad flew B-17s in the war, and I want to go sit where he sat, or he was a gunner, and I want to go see what it was like to do what he did. Some of the people writing in were saying, well, our grandpa's still with us. He was a crew member on a 17, and we want to take him up flying one more time. So it was pretty immediate that we started getting these powerful stories. The ones that were really interesting to me were younger people who were writing in saying, my great grandpa was a B-17 top turret gunner. And they didn't know much else. They just said, we know he did that, and here was his name. And while we were setting up the flight, one of the things I would do in the next day or so was, as time would permit, I would try to research this gentleman and find him in a bomb group. The bomb group associations keep remarkable records. A lot of times I was able to actually pull up a crew photo, including this gentleman in it, and then I would email them back and say, you're all set up to go flying at 10 o'clock in Cleveland, Ohio. And by the way, here's a picture of your grandfather that you've never seen. This is him during World War II. And of course, it was a hit. I mean, people really enjoyed that. They didn't know that information was out there. The other end of the spectrum was people that did know that information was out there and didn't know what to do with it. They knew they were very proud of their loved one. They would come forward with their personal photo albums of these unpublished photos that were just amazing. With their permission, we asked them if it was okay to get stories from them. We had scanners. We could actually scan the photo albums and help preserve these. We didn't want the originals. We want them to have the original photos. We just wanted to know, could we scan these and have digital copies? Because there's a lot of education in these photos, these non-published photos, just in the way crews wore their uniforms, the way aircraft were painted, maybe how things weathered. It was really, really amazing. So at first, it was just more of here's a cool way to enhance the B-17 program a bit. And then it really drove into more of, this is the reason why we're flying this airplane. And then it became, on the order of Rose Pelton, actually, Jack Pelton's wife, that you guys need to do a book and you should put a book together about this experience. So the book's called The Final Mission because my PowerPoint that I've given a good bit is called the same thing. And so tonight you'll hear some of the stories of that we've heard around these airplanes. And I know I'm talking to people who spend a lot of time around very similar aircraft. We all know it. We know that these airplanes are a catalyst for hearing the stories come out, whether they're firsthand from the veteran or from family members who had a loved one who was a P-51 pilot or something. And it's really the core of what we do and why it's so important. So I know there's been a lot in the news about these aircraft, but to me, this is the exact reason of why it's important that we keep these flying. So tonight, we'll talk a little bit about that. Keep in mind, I usually give this talk to people who don't know anything about a B-17. So just bear with me as I tell you a little bit about it. I know you guys probably know a good bit, but there's the first B-17 right there that was rolled out of the hangar in 1935. The Army and the Navy were at pretty high odds about who were the true protectors of this country. And there wasn't enough funding to go around in this time period. So, of course, when these contracts would come up for big aircraft, something like that, depending on what it was, other aircraft companies may or may not really jump in. The United States Army Air Corps put out a contract for a heavy bomber. And a lot of the aircraft companies said, you're only going to buy a few of these. We're not going to really risk a lot. We're going to go and modify stuff that we already have in works. Boeing said, no way. We're going to risk the future of the company, go back to our shareholders, our investors, tell them that we believe in this project and get them to donate more money to the cause. And that's exactly what they did. They built the Model 299. That's it on rollout day. I always like to drive home that, look at the cars that are in the parking lot. I mean, those are the cars the reporters drove to the unveiling that day. Around the corner is a Boeing 247. That was a frontline airliner at the time. The airplane rolls out. It had 5 caliber machine guns on it originally, and a newspaper reporter was standing there from the Seattle Times, and he said, "My God, it's a flying fortress." And Boeing had somebody standing nearby that heard that. They immediately went back to Boeing headquarters and copyrighted the name, and therefore the airplane was named the Flying Fortress. Nobody had ever seen an airplane this big, 103-foot wingspan. That wingspan would actually stay the same the entire production length of the B-17, and I think it was about 75 feet long, something like that. So an airplane this big, people said, well, it's going to be really cumbersome. It's not going to be a good flying airplane. It's going to be kind of a dog, slow. And that was just the opposite. The airplane actually took off to go to where this contest was going to be held to decide the contract. And that was at Wright Field down in Dayton, Ohio. And the airplane broke a speed and altitude record of the day. As a matter of fact, that speed and altitude record were both or currently held at the time by fighters, single engine pursuit airplanes. So everybody said, well, Boeing is going to clean up at this event. And they did. The first few days of the fly off, it was pretty evident that Boeing was going to clean up in the contract. That was until a fateful day when the crash happened. They crashed the Model 299. The pilots got distracted, tried to take off with the gust locks still engaged. The airplane rose off the end of the runway and then crashed, totally wiping out the only 299 that existed. So that's it. Boeing's out of the running. The United States Army Air Corps said, we love the airplane. We cannot award a contract to an airplane that did not finish the competition. So all of the subsequent orders out of the contest would go to a very glamorous looking B-18, and kind of looks like a flying guppy or something there. But if you really take a look at that B-18, what you see is a lot of DC-2. There's a lot of DC-2, DC-3 kind of shapes in there. The tail, the engine nacelles, the wing. They basically modified a DC-2, and that was, they didn't think in a million years they were going to win this contract. Now the B-18 basically stayed as a stateside trainer. It did not see a lot of combat. It did see some. It saw some anti-submarine missions, but mainly it was held back to be a trainer for bombardiers, navigators, things like that. The United States Army Air Corps, however, was able to order some YB-17s through a loophole. What they found out was they had a loophole that would allow them to order experimental weapons, and the now designated B-17, it was the 299. They were able to order 13 of them. The Y that came ahead of it, the YB-17, basically denoted where they got the money to order it. That was to show that it came from this fund for experimental weapons. The first ones to see combat weren't Army Air Corps aircraft, though. They were Royal Air Force Fortress 1s that were given to the Royal Air Force under Lend-Lease. RAF came back, said they're a great airplane. However, they're lacking in some armament. We need something to beef up that tail. So back to the drawing board, Boeing went. They sort of changed up the rear fuselage of the airplane and went with the E model B-17 that you see here. So the E model B-17 had the new tail stinger, had top and ball turrets. We'll talk about that ball turret in a little bit. And it was kind of a whole new airplane. This is what Boeing was going to have to make in order for the war to, for the war effort. First squadron of B-17s went out to Pearl Harbor. And let me try and fix my PowerPoint. It's kind of getting ahead of me here. And Keegan, I don't know if you can see that, but my PowerPoint is a little off. But at any rate, the first B-17s landed out at Hickam Field, and were, of course, landing under fire on December 7th, 1941. They flew straight into the middle of the war, low on fuel. Their guns on board the aircraft were actually still packed in crates, and they had nowhere else to go. So these airplanes landed. Some of them ditched. Some of them actually landed on a golf course. And this one here. So there's a big story about this. We actually had a crew member who flew with us who was on board this airplane, and the story always was that a bomb had hit it. Well, the real story was that there were flares on board, and a Japanese Zero came by, strafed them after they landed, and then it lit the flares off. So very interesting to see sort of a little bit about really what was going on there. So again, something that we learned about along the way was that what we always thought we were looking at in some pictures, we weren't actually seeing. There was different history to some of it. So, but let's continue on here and see what I can do. And I'm sorry that my slides are a little messed up, but let me see if I can fix this here.
Perhaps it's worth trying just scrolling down manually as opposed to clicking the advancer button.
Okay, not drawing on it like I just did. Let's see. Yeah, it won't let me manually move it.
If you go ahead and kind of talk through this slide, I'll have my copy of the PowerPoint ready to go, and we can transition to that.
Okay, sounds good. I'll just talk from that. Okay, well, thanks for bearing with us. Ed Hudson, who was in this crew photo that you may or not be able to see because it's a little split. Ed was a ball turret gunner, lower turret gunner, and he went out to ahead of his airplane arriving. And Ed was in his barracks on early morning, December 7th, and one of his bunkmates woke him up and said that there was airplanes attacking the base. So Ed runs out and sees that people are shooting at airplanes with shotguns and pistols. And he said, well, I knew there was a .30 caliber, so I made everybody follow me down. We grabbed the 30 cal. I grabbed some ammo and the ammo cans, and we headed to the door. Just as I got to the door, he said I blacked out. And when he came to, a bunch of guys were lifting a wall off of him. And here what had happened was a bomb had hit the building or near the building, and it exploded, and the wall caved in on him. And the only thing that saved his life was he was carrying 2 cans of ammo, and when that wall came down, the cans of ammo pried the wall up off of him enough so he didn't get crushed. Had he not had those, he would have been killed. Ed would later go on to serve in both the European and Pacific Theater, and later in the 398th Bomb Group. So he actually had kills, both Japanese and German kills. So kind of a rare thing to get from the turret. Perfect. Okay. So they fought with what they had, and that was very true. There wasn't the good news that we were hoping for that come out of the Pacific early on in the war. The first American bomber to drop a bomb during World War II was a B-17. These crews were out in the Pacific hunting whatever they could find. You know, they were in the Philippines, things like that, trying to just get a foothold wherever they could. They were taking on massive formations of Japanese airplanes, and they weren't doing it like the European theater where, you know, they had a tour of duty that they flew and they went home. They kind of didn't know what to do with them. They just kept flying. We'll jump over to the next slide. So that brings us to Major Eugene Benedetti. Now, something I want to talk about as we're talking about these guys and women is the age that our World War II veterans were. Major Benedetti was 20 years old, and he was flying a B-17. Japanese Zeros attacked his aircraft, and shells came through the aircraft, hit his co-pilot and killed his co-pilot, struck him as well, and shot out the intercom. So he had no way to hand off the airplane to anybody. He was wounded himself, lost the vision out of his right eye, and it wasn't until a half hour later that the top turret gunner came down to see what was going on. So for about a half hour in great pain, Eugene flew the airplane, and even once they stabbed him with morphine that was on board the aircraft, he refused to leave and helped land the airplane when they got it back to base. It took 70 years, but eventually he would earn his Silver Star for the day, for his actions that day. His daughter Janice was going to come out and fly with us, and she surprised us. When she showed up, she was wearing his A2 jacket, and with it was the Silver Star pinned to it. And it's pretty cool for us to get a chance to see that. But again, we're talking about the age. You're talking about guys that were 19, 20, 21 years old. Truly remarkable. We can go to the next slide. The Bloody Yanks arrive in England. That's Mr. Milner. When he arrived, that was him in training in an F model B-17, actually. And the Royal Air Force and the British, they didn't really know what to make of us when we got there. There were some common phrases like we were oversexed, overpaid, and over there. And we drank our beer cold, and they like their beer warm. But we had a common enemy, and that was fighting back the Germans. And so it was something that they were relieved and yet nervous that we were there. They weren't really sure of us. But the B-17, this is what it would become famous for, was this action, the combat in the European theater of the war. This is the stuff that legends were made out of. We'll go to the next slide. So how were we going to differ from the Royal Air Force? Well, the Royal Air Force was bombing at night. They actually tried some early missions in daytime, and they did not go well. So the Royal Air Force said, well, they had to focus their wartime production of aircraft on fighters to cover their homeland. So the bombers weren't necessarily a luxury they had a ton of option to do. They did, of course, have airplanes like the Lancaster, the wonderful Mosquito, but they couldn't dedicate these massive just formations that we could. We went over there with the idea that we were going to do something different. We were going to go in a daytime, and it's a lot different. Now, the nice thing about nighttime is they can't see you. The enemy has a harder time seeing you. But the bad thing is your bombing, of course, isn't as accurate. Going in the daytime, more accurate. We had something called the Norden Bombsight, which you can see there in the front of a B-17. This is one of the highest secrets of World War II. As a matter of fact, before you became a bombardier, you had to actually take an oath to protect that bomb site with your life. And we're going to go to daytime. Now, the nice thing about the daytime is we can see our target. We can see the railroad junction, the building, what it is that we want to hit. The bad thing is they can see us. And the two main ways they were going to try and stop us were fighter aircraft like the 109 and the FW-190. Of course, later the 262. And of course, flak, anti-aircraft fire. So those are the two ways they were going to try to shoot you down and stop your squadron. We can go to the next slide. Now, usually I ask for some hands, but of course I can't see them, so you can still put them up. It makes you feel good. But I always ask people, how many people have seen Aluminum Overcast, our B-17? Our airplane is painted that way for a specific reason. We didn't just pick it out of nowhere. And it's a story that isn't always really told that well. What you're looking at right now is the picture of the original crew of Aluminum Overcast, the real one. That is the B-17 30H. It had the code letters painted on the side, and it flew in the 398th Bomb Group. The gentleman standing in the top left is a guy by the name of Hal Weekly. And Hal was a real spark plug. When we got this airplane, he was there every day, and he was there beating the war drum of why this restoration was important, why we need to fly it. He also was the highest time B-17 pilot in the world. He would continue to fly this airplane on tour. So think about that. You're buying a ride on a B-17, and you're going to get to go fly with a B-17 pilot from the war. Now, of course, we've approached a time where that isn't happening, but for a great time in the 80s, we were able to do that. A great story about Hal was he went out on a mission, and the deal was if you didn't come back from your mission after a few days, your stuff was fair game. Your foot locker would get cracked open and people would take your clean socks and even your love letters home, things like that. Well, Hal and his crew had to ditch, and they took them about 2 weeks to get back to their base. And Hal and the guy said, there's no way our stuff will still be there when we get back. They finally get back to their base, and all of their stuff is there untouched. And Hal started asking around. He said, "What gives?" And they said, "You're too big of a guy. We were afraid you might still be alive, so we wouldn't touch your gear." So his crew got all their stuff back, and I guess he was just a guy they didn't want to mess with. But Hal was a real spark plug for our airplane. Our airplane is painted as the one that he flew that you see in the picture there. So a little bit of the background about why you see our airplane painted that way. We can go ahead to the next one. Captain Ed Stevens. Ed was 19 years old. He had been an ambulance driver prior to the war and had some basic first aid training. He, I get the airplanes that are named after girls back home and stuff like that. This airplane was named the Fish and Chip Special. I have no idea where they got the name for that. But on a mission he was flying into Germany, right as they crossed the coast, their crew got hit by anti-aircraft fire. And every member of the crew, except for him, was wounded. He turned the airplane around, and the crew begged him to bail out and call Air Sea Rescue, save himself, and the rest of the crew would try to nurse the airplane back home. He refused. He descended the airplane to 50 feet above the water, hoping that would stop fighters from trying to dive in on him. And on two engines, he flew for about 6 hours, fighting this airplane back home. He got to a base. It wasn't their home base, but it was a base that he was able to land on. And on short final, he lost another engine. So he landed on one engine. And then in a picture on the right, you can see he couldn't keep it on the runway. It departed the runway the one direction. But he gets out and he does something remarkable. He doesn't, he's not just thankful for himself. He's not, thinking about anything else but his crew. And in that picture on the left, that's him giving first aid to his crew. He immediately just went back into that training he had and started to take care of his guys. The crews became so tight that they were family. A lot of them said that they wouldn't even talk to other crews. They would just stick to each other. And that's what it meant. These guys meant the world to each other on board that airplane. So we'll talk a little bit more about how the crews develop and work together too. We can go to the next one, Keegan. Pat Patterson. So one of the things I also do, or did, I'm in a different position now, but I helped work with the media flights. And what I sort of found out was that the media flights, you can only tell people that B-17 was coming some to your airport so often, and the media didn't really kind of, so if there was nothing going on, they'd care, and but if something else happened, they didn't really want to cover it that much. What I was able to do is I would start reaching out to find out who a hometown hero was that maybe flew on a B-17, and I would find him, contact them. If they were willing, they'd come up and fly with us. And first off, it's the right thing to do. It's just cool to have a veteran back with his old aircraft. But then we were able to also let the media know that, hey, like we're taking one of your hometown heroes. This is a big deal. And it is a big deal. When these guys came home from the war, they were front page news, especially in small towns. So we go to a lot of small towns, and it's one more chance they have to be front page news again. And it was really funny. A buddy of mine nicknamed me Elwood uh, as a reference to the Blues Brothers, because he said I would call veterans and tell them that we're putting the band back together, and you'd get these veterans that were, when they answered the phone, they were, a really old voice, and then as you started talking to them about, hey, we're gonna go fly B-17 again, let's go, you could hear it, you could hear them, their youth coming back a little bit, and of course, once they're near the airplane, all bets are off. I mean, they really, um, it's a little bit of a fountain of youth effect for them. And like I said, I know I'm talking to a group of people that know that and see that. So Pat Patterson, uh, he we had to break it to him gently that day. He crawled up into the airplane and he just immediately got right back into the pilot seat. And we had to kind of break it to him. He was going to ride behind the pilots that day, but in the black and white photo on the left, that's him standing on the top left. And two stories he had. One was that on short notice, they asked him to take a reporter up with him. And he said, okay, fine, it's not a big deal. Well, it turned out he'd later find out that reporter that flew with him on this mission was Andy Rooney from 60 Minutes, or what would later become 60 Minutes. At the time, he was a reporter for Stars and Stripes. The other story he told me was that he had a ball turret gunner. They were down for repairs that day, and another crew had a sick ball turret gunner, and they said, would your guy fill in for ours? They were kind of friendly with that crew, and they said sure, and so he went and did that. Around the time that the bombers would be due back, he said we would always go out and watch the airplanes coming in. Couple reasons: one, you wanted to see if your friend came through or not, and the other one was because you wanted to know, you knew where they were going, and you might have to go there in a day or two, and you wanted to see how bad the damage, how bad the airplanes were coming back, if it was, if it was a bad target or not. So um, he said we go out and there's an airplane circling around, and they couldn't figure out why this one B-17 was circling all by itself. And somebody from the tower came down and said, that's the airplane with your ball turret gunner in it. And the gear is stuck up, and he's stuck in the turret. And I know that this is a cliched story. This story has floated around the internet and everything forever, but we were never able to point to a person who actually had it happen. And Pat gave us that answer. This was something that happened at least in the 388th, where, geez, sorry if there's a dog in the background. I have a beagle, guys. Sorry, she sees a squirrel. um, but basically, this crew had to land with their ball turret gunner stuck in the ball, and in a 17, that turret doesn't go up or down. It's the first thing that hits. And this gentleman lost his life in the crash that day. And Pat said, this is something that always affected me. I thought about it every day. This gentleman who made one decision, it changed the outcourse of the rest of his life. And I never forgot that. So very powerful. Think about it. That gunner was probably around 18, 19 years old, I would guess. Um, you're talking about people that are just out of high school. So again, just amazing people, an amazing generation. Keegan, we can go to the next one. Donald Camp, he was in the 15th Air Force, and he was a radio operator. And we got a great picture of him back in his seat. That picture through the window on the lower right, it was a very cold day. We were in Florida, and his whole family, they're bundled up in jackets. It's kind of funny because it was probably like 60 degrees, and in Wisconsin, we'd be like golfing. But in Florida, they're all bundled up in jackets. But Donald came out to fly with us. We put Donald in the seat. His wife came on board and sat with him for a little bit and talked. And then she got out and we went flying with the other passengers and crew. And it was about, I want to say it was about a week later, we get a call from his daughter to let us know that Donald had passed. And she said, "You don't know just what that day meant to him." And she said he was in the ambulance on the way to the hospital, and they have an oxygen mask on him. And she says he's pulling his oxygen mask off so that he could tell the paramedics that he got to go flying in his B-17 one more time. And that affected all of us. That hit us hard because we'd all had a good time talking with Donald. And not only did we lose him, but then we get this emotional story. So what you do out there with these airplanes matters. And that's the biggest thing I hope people take away from this is it really matters to a lot of people, not just the veteran, but to the families and other people that are trying to study this stuff. So it's very important to keep them flying. Keegan, we can go to the next one. So, of course, talking about World War II, we have to talk about the brave men who flew combat missions. That's what the goal is. However, there were also really brave women who did their part during World War II. Blanche Barnes is a great one example of that. I'm going to use Blanche's quote. She said that what her duty was in the war was something that would be very popular at general aviation airports today. She said we were a truck that played swing music, driven by pretty girls that handed out free donuts. And I don't disagree with her. That probably would be pretty popular at general aviation airports. Um, but Blanche joined the Red Cross after her husband was killed in the B-24, and she drove what they called a clubmobile. They had donuts they'd hand out. They'd play swing music, and she would actually, dance with some of the guys and things like that. She said guys were always excited to hear and talk to an American girl. That's her on the right. That's her handing out donuts to the 303rd Bomb Group, and she was coming out to fly with us. And her and her family, or her family, told us about her story. They had emailed us some pictures, and we said, "Well, what can we do to make this a memorable event? It shouldn't be just you bought your ticket, get on the airplane, fly, and then leave, and that's it. We really can do more." And but we were trying to figure out what to do with Blanche. If we go to the next slide, you'll see what we did was we had donuts delivered to the airplane that morning, and then we decorated the boxes with her pictures, copies of her pictures, and surprised her. She immediately grabbed the donut boxes and started handing out donuts to the crews and to the people that were all around. So again, muscle memory kicked in, but it was a special day for us, and our crew always happy to have donuts as well. So we'll go to the next slide. So for years, when I thought of Rosie the Riveter, I thought of the poster. I mean, I think that's what most people do. Um, that changed when we met June Smokey Morris. She worked at the Boeing plant in Seattle. She worked night shift, and her shift, what they did was her job was the last step on the production line. She would install a fuel tank, seal up the wing. The airplane would be pushed outside and test flown, and off to the base it'd go. Um, she finished up her night shift, came home in the morning, found out that her dad, who was a merchant marine, had been killed by a German U-boat. And Boeing actually was having a labor dispute, and it was supposed to start that night. And they told her not to come to work because there was going to be a picket line and she couldn't cross. Um, she came to work that night regardless, and her job was a two-person job. She had a bucker named Helen, and they told her, you're not supposed to be here. And she said, I'm going to cross the picket line. It has nothing to do with with anything other than I want to get revenge for my dad. World War II had become personal for June. And her bucker, Helen, crossed with her. And together, that night, those two women alone worked on and finished their B-17. Now, June had worked and built thousands of B-17s. And we were coming out to Seattle, and we asked, June, had you ever flown in one? And she said, oddly enough, no, I'd built thousands, but I've never flown in one. So Keegan, we'll go to the next slide. And we changed that when we were out there, and we took her up flying with us. And it was kind of funny. The some of the media reporters were there waiting to get her words, and I think they just kind of wanted to get her soundbite for 30 seconds and then go off to whatever. And instead, she drug them under the wing and gave them like a half-hour dissertation on rivets and the rivets that she drove and why it was important. So that was a really cool flight. I'm glad we got to get Blanche up there, or I'm sorry, June up there. Next slide, please. So there are certain things that you have to understand and this will sound cheesy, and just bear with me. There's magic in these aircraft, and this is one that I couldn't put this together. If I tried, it wouldn't happen. We get a call from Mrs. Goldman, who said that her husband was losing his battle with cancer, and that he had a bucket list item, and that was to fly on a B-17. And oh, okay, great, and we told her the cost, and she said, we due to medical bills and things, we can't afford that. She didn't know how much it was. So I kept her number and stuff, and I said, well, let me see if there's anything I can do. I'll call you back. And I didn't have time. About 2 hours later, we get a guy who calls and says, I'd flown on your airplane last year. It was awesome. I'd like to buy 2 seats and then just anonymously donate them to somebody who has a story. So I told him the story, and he said, yeah, let's do this. And I come back, and I said, Faith, we had somebody donate some seats. And I said, so just out of curiosity, I take it, your husband was a crew member. And she said no, he was too young to be on a B-17. And I said, okay, well, why is this a bucket list? And I could not be prepared for what she told me. He was in a concentration camp as a kid, and death was all around him in this camp. He accepted that he was going to die in this camp, and the camp was eventually liberated. And the guys who liberated it didn't really know what it was or what to do with it, so they kept calling for help. And they eventually got to the 388th Bomb Group, I believe, and they said, well, we don't know what to do. However, we can send the B-17 with some food loaded in it, and we'll make a couple trips. So there was a B-17. It was the same airplane, called Pandemonium Rains, and that airplane did 3 runs into a concentration camp dropping food. Now imagine you think you're going to die, and she said suddenly here's an airplane with these beautiful stars on the wings, and it's raining food into the camp. That's why he wanted to fly on the airplane. So I was blown away. I mean, just an amazing story. So a couple days later, this flight is all set up. We're ready to go. We get a call from a guy who said, I want to buy a ride for my dad. And as I'm talking to him, he says, my dad flew the 17. He flew 35 missions. He doesn't really talk about it. But you know what he does talk about is this day that he flew missions into a concentration camp dropping food. And it turns out it was the same pilot. If we go to the next slide, we can see the crew. That's the crew that did that. That's not their normal airplane they're standing in front of, but that is the crew that did that. So we were able to actually put members of the pilot of the B-17, as well as the people who were in the concentration camp having food dropped on them together on one flight, and we took them up in our radio room. So that's the kind of stuff that we're able to put together that, again, that wouldn't happen anywhere else. We can go to the next slide. So, sorry, I'm trying to mute around my dog, who apparently squirrels are very persistent here in Wisconsin right now. Built Boeing tough. It sounds like an ad for Boeing, but it really is what the airplane was famous for. The B-17 was famous for taking punishment and bringing the crews home. Mizpah, the airplane in the center, lower center, had the entire nose blown off. The pilots are still in control in that picture. They kept the wings level long enough to get everybody to bail out. As a testament to that, 8 of the 10 crew bailed out safely, and we flew the pilot, the daughter of the pilot, on board our airplane. Top right is a 306 airplane. It came back with its vertical just about gone and horizontal shredded. And on the top left, my favorite one, these guys were on short final on 2 engines. They lost their other engine and they landed on just one engine, the number 3. And they said, well, number 3 got us home. And as the airplane rolled out, the number 3 engine fell off the airplane. That is exactly what the B-17 did. And a lot of times it would bring the crews home and then just die once it got on the ramp, and just, it would never fly again. A lot of times they'd be scrapped. We'll go to the next slide. So George Freitag is a perfect example of that. George flew in the 43rd Bomb Group. He was a top turret gunner. His best friend was a radio operator. And he told us this story that we had to dig deeper into. And that was that his airplane came back with over 30,000 holes in it. Now, I'm going to let that sink in, because you got your all airplane people. 30,000 holes. And I'm like, there's no way. His airplane was took a direct flak hit in the bomb bay, and was able to still make it back. While the airplane gets hit, the radio room is on fire. He goes back to check on his friend, his best friend, this radio operator, puts out the fire. His best friend is wounded, but not bad. However, he finds out the parachute is shredded. And at the same time, the pilot basically radios that, hey guys, I think we should think about bailing out. The radio operator said, well, you have to bail out, save yourself, and I'm going to ride the airplane down. And George said, no way. George takes his parachute off, throws it out the window, and he says, if you're not going to bail, I'm not going to bail either. And now the pilot has 2 guys that can't bail. They all decided to stay together. They nursed the airplane home to the landing field. The brakes are shot out. They can't even stop the airplane. So they use cruise parachutes tied to the waist gun mounts, and that's what you see there. That's how they stop the airplane. So he told us this story, and we're like, we want to believe that, but man, that's a lot. And then he said, go to contact the Air Force. So we actually contacted Maxwell Air Force Base, and we just wanted to hear more about it. And they actually backed it all up and sent us more pictures. And there's actually a memorial to this airplane down at Warner Robbins Air Force Base. So it holds the record for the most combat damaged American airplane to ever return from a mission. So George was not making it up. He was telling us the truth. We can go to the next one. And there's the interior. This is what Warner Robbins gave us. There's some of the interior. What you're looking at is the radio room into the bomb bay. You can see just how shredded out that floor is. We can keep going, Keegan. Some of the things that I get to do is pretty cool. Kind of putting history together for families. On the left side, we had Todd Talton. He was a pilot in the 384th Bomb Group, and his son had that picture. And he said, I didn't have a picture of this damaged. He had all the love letters to him and his wife, and he said, he had these letters to my mom, and he mentioned he brought back an airplane really damaged one time. I'd love to see a picture of that. We're able to find it. That's a picture on the right, and that was a flak burst that went off underneath the left wing, and he was able to bring that home. And my favorite part of that isn't the damage. It's like the cocky 22-year-old that's leaning on the airplane showing off his damage. I think that's fantastic. We can go to the next one, Keegan. Sergeant Harvin Abrahamson. He's actually a Milwaukee native, and he had a great story. So he had 2 great stories. One was on a mission. One of the bombs didn't drop out of the bomb bay, and he said that I knew I was in trouble. The crew chief, or the flight engineer, I'm sorry, basically waved at me to come out over to that open bomb bay, and he said I go out there, and he says we got an idea. We're gonna hold you by the back of your jacket out over this open bomb bay, and you're gonna work on this shackle and get it loose to drop this bomb. And I was like, my gosh, what did you think of? And he goes, I was fine until I looked down. He says, then I was ruined. But he said, I did get that bomb loose. The other story he had was sitting in the radio room, a flak shell, it's about the size of a ketchup bottle, came through the floor, through his table, and then basically fell into there's a compartment above the radio room where early models had a 50 caliber machine gun in there, but there's a sort of a shelf in there, and it fell on there and just rattled around. And he said it appeared that it was a dud, but I kept thinking this thing was going to go off any minute. And he says, and I couldn't get at it. He goes, so I had to sit there for 4 hours and fly home with this round sitting up there. And I said, what did you do? And he says, well, I lit up a cigarette and I smoked a cigarette. And I said, okay. And he goes, that's a big deal because I don't smoke. I was like, okay, I get it. So he said, we get home and they take that shell and they took it apart and they found out that they had left a note that the Germans were using slave labor and that this was a sabotage shell on purpose. The people that were being forced into slave labor were risking their lives to make duds right off the assembly line. So he said, I don't know how often that happened, but they saved one Milwaukee boy. We can go to the next slide. Um, you know, again, I talked about magic, and there's certain things that I couldn't have planned for. We get a call one day from a very nice lady, Fern Bridges, and she said that her husband was a radio operator in the 91st Bomb Group. His name was Alan Chandler, and he was still listed after all these years as MIA. They never found what happened to his airplane. Um, and she said, could I just wanted to come out and see where he sat on the airplane. So we had her come out. We surprised her. We had a picture of him in his airplane, and we actually took her flying. She didn't just come out and see it. She went out and flew. And I had a little Facebook album that I would keep, and it was just for fun. It was started out just for me, and then as it kind of caught on, I'd share it, with EAA and say, hey, this is kind of cool. This happened, and then it kind of became a thing where I would actually do this for EAA. Well, I posted this on Facebook, the picture on the right of Fern, and about a couple weeks later, I get a call from the government, and they said, "How do you know this woman?" And I'm like, "Oh my God, what did she do?" And so I'm like, "Well, I don't know her at all." I was like, "We gave her a ride. She seemed like a really nice lady." And they're like, "Well, do you have her contact info?" And here, what was happening was they had discovered the airplane, they thought, but they had no contact info for Fern, and they wanted me to make the call to get them connected. I called Fern, explained to her what was going on, and I said, this doesn't make sense. How could they not have your contact info? And she said, well, that makes sense because before he left for the war, I was pregnant, and he was afraid that I would go through something bad if I wasn't with somebody, and I got bad news. He didn't want me being by myself, so he had me move in with his parents, and then he made his parents the next of kin for everything. So she's like, well, this makes sense. They sent a DNA kit, and they swabbed Alan's son's cheeks, and a few weeks later, we got the results that the crash site was indeed Alan Chandler's crash site, and we were able to recover the remains. And Keegan, if you advance the slide, um, in May 2 years ago, we were able to bring the entire crew home, and he's buried now with his crew at Arlington National Cemetery, and that's actually Fern on the right getting the his burial flag. So that's something I never thought I'd get to be a small part of, and I'm really thankful that I was. It's again, it's not me, it's the airplane that's able to do this kind of thing. We can go to the next slide. John Terabiola was another one. We found out he was celebrating an anniversary, him and his wife, and we thought we'd surprise him. Interesting story. He surprised us, which is pretty comical. Um, Prior to leaving for the war, he had asked for permission to marry his girlfriend Jo. He asked her dad, and her dad said yeah. He had already bought a safety deposit box with an engagement ring, and he said, I'll let you know when it's time. And if she says yeah, when I ask her, you could take her down to the box and get the ring. So he flies 24 missions. He sends this telegram home, which they still have. And he says, if the answer is yes, let your dad know and you can go get your ring. So we're all set up here to do this flight and honor their anniversary as well. And we had 2 seats set aside for them to go flying. And we take them out to the airplane and we put Joe in, his wife. And we go to John and we said, it's your turn. And he says, oh, I'm not getting back in this thing. And we're like, what do you mean? We have 2 seats for you. And he said, I made a deal. He said, on our 25th mission, we came back all shot up and we had the belly land. And he said, I prayed and I said, if you get me out of this, God, I'll never fly again. He said, that was the last time I've ever flown in an airplane and I've got to keep to it. So his daughter got on board and went flying, and he went back for seconds on cake, and everybody had a good day out there. So it's pretty fun day though. Keegan, we can go to the next one. Where did they all go? That's for some reason that didn't come through right, but that's Jack Wallace. So let me talk about that. Jack Wallace was a tail gunner, 91st Bomb Group, and the story that I like about this was he was feeling kind of depressed. He was a bit down in the dumps, and he went flying with us. And his daughter wrote me a letter, and she said, "You're not going to believe this, but the very next day, I go to pick him up after the flight, and here comes this cocky uh, World War II vet, if you will." She's like, he didn't have a walker anymore, and he was kind of walking with a bit more pride. And again, that's another example of you get a little bit of their youth back when you get them around these airplanes. We can go to the next one. Our airplane is a true survivor. Our airplane only survived simply because somebody took an interest in it as a business prospect. The airplane flew hauling oil and cattle, and eventually became a sprayer, and then was donated to us from Dr. Bill Harrison, and we've restored it to how it looks today. We can continue on. And why do we have an airplane? Why does the EAA have a B-17? We're an organization that's all about building airplanes in your garage. Well, one thing is we like to try to make sure people know that airports are someplace in their community that the whole area should look at. It's their GA airport. They're welcome. But the other part is it's inspirational for young people, and you can influence their paths with this airplane. Scott Taylor on the left was interested because of his grandfather, who's in the middle picture. And he got so interested in this, he came to Air Academy, was a first EA Air Academy graduate, went on to fly F-15s after going to the Air Force Academy. And on the right, that's actually the Culpepper family. The great grandfather was a B-17 pilot. So that's them enjoying a day out at the airplane. We inspire our youth by honoring our heroes, and it's very true. I firmly believe that. We can go to next. Freedom Flight was when we actually put 10 vets back on board the airplane. We had Bombardier all the way back to tail gunner. That took about, I was right about 3 months worth of work. We took them up on a 30-degree day, which I did not think was going to be really well. I think they'd be well received. And these guys instead get out of the airplane and they said, "Thank you for giving us back our airplane." We know the airplane at air shows, when it's warm, but when we flew it in combat, it was cold. They could see our breath, and they said it was like that. So that was a pretty special day for us. We can go to the next one, Keegan. Now I'm going to let you all in on a little secret. I live here in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. I'm not from Wisconsin. I'm from Pittsburgh. I'm a Steelers fan. I'm sorry to tell y'all. But flying over Packers Stadium or Lambeau Field for the opening of a game was pretty cool. We didn't know it, but we got a thank you letter the next day from a family who just a few blocks away were laying to rest their World War II veteran grandfather. And we had no idea. We flew over the funeral home right when it was happening. So sometimes we affect people and we don't even know it. We can go to the next slide. So when we did that Freedom Flight, we put that full crew together. We had a ball turret gunner named Fred Zerbakken. And Fred his family told me Fred wouldn't do it. He's too humble. That he had earned a Purple Heart, but he never got it. So he did some investigating, found out that that was very true. And the Air Force and the Army said they worked together and said, yeah, The records check out. We will send you a Purple Heart and have it presented. We lied to him and said we wanted him to check out an exhibit. When he gets there, his whole family was there to be surprised. And we were surprised. The military included a note, and the note was why he didn't get his Purple Heart. He had gone on a mission, was hit by flak, and was hospitalized. And 10 days later, he found out that his crew was going to go flying with a replacement ball turret gunner. And that didn't sit well with him. And he said, no way. And his waist gunners were bribed to come in, bring his gear, get him dressed, sneak him out of the hospital where he went AWOL. And that screwed up the paperwork. But he went back to flying missions. He was 17 years old when he did this. He had lied about his age to join the Army Air Force to start with. And just an inspirational guy. And we were able to give him his Purple Heart that he'd earned many years ago, but at least we were able to give it back. What we didn't know was when we gave it to him, we actually gave it to him on the week of the anniversary of him being hit. We had no idea that was happening. So really, really cool guy. Fred was a neat guy. We can go to the next slide. As Keegan said, I was honored to give this talk at the opening of the Memphis Belle presentation, or the opening of the exhibit. We took our aluminum overcast down there with 2 other B-17s, and really had a complete honor. And it was really kind of full circle because that airplane, the Memphis Belle, is one that really first got me into the B-17 as well. So to have that chance to do that was a high honor, and to have our airplane there was extra special as well. We'll continue on. And last but not least is something I always say is we're not restoring paint and rivets. We're restoring a legacy and preserving a legacy. So on our airplane, when you fly, you buy the ride, you get a green, well, you have to buy it, but you can't buy this until you've gone on a flight. You can get a green jacket. And it has our airplane embroidered on it. A lot of you guys have probably seen them before. The jackets took on a special meaning for me after my first media flight. My first media flight, I had 9 members of the media and a waist gunner all set to go flying. And the next morning, somebody in Hollywood had done something bizarre, and the media jumped off the flight and they said, we want to go cover that. And now you have this flight built up for this veteran and you have no media to cover it. Well, we didn't care. We're still going to go flying. And we put the veteran's family, who had all come from all over to be around, to go flying with them. So we do this flight on a Thursday, and I come to work on Monday and I get a call from the son who's trying to order the jacket for his dad. And I'm like, okay. And he goes, I need to overnight it. I want to express ship it. And we said, sure, no problem. So we get all set. And I said, how did the flight go? And he goes, let me tell you about this. And he goes, we had family in from all over. And then it turns out we get to go flying with them. And we come back and we said, we don't get to see each other a lot. We're all here. Let's go to dinner. So we go to dinner. And Dad mentions that after each mission, they would have a shot of scotch. And he said, okay, so we had that at dinner as well. And he said that night, Dad had a notebook. He told us he kept the log of all his missions. And he said he showed it to us. And then he wrote, mission number 36, I flew with my family. And he said that night, we all went home and Dad passed away in his sleep. And he said the jacket, and why we needed express shipped, is we want to bury him in the jacket. To him, this was how he wanted history to remember him. We get this a lot where guys, they want to be remembered as a tail gunner from the 91st Bomb Group. This was a very short period of their life, but it was a very important part. So this is part of what we do, and it's part of what you do. And anybody who's around one of these airplanes, it's our responsibility to make sure we tell this story, because we're soon going to be out of our World War II vets. It's going to be up to us to carry that fire and keep going that forward with it. So I want to thank you guys. I know we're going to turn it open for questions, but I want to just say thank you for having me. It's always a privilege, and I love your museum. I've been there several times, and thank you for what you guys do to support it and keep them flying. So I think the next slide, Keegan, is just some information on me, but you could drop me an email if you like. And we do have the book out, The Final Mission. And I'm not really one to plug things, so it's just an honor to be here, and thanks for having me. So I know we're gonna open up some questions, but Keegan, do your best. If I don't know, I have Google right here, or I will make something up.
Well, Chris, I know I speak for everyone when I say thank you, not just for giving us this presentation, but thank you for the efforts that you and the other folks at EAA have put into just really this incredible body of work that has been honoring veterans, sharing their stories, connecting them to the next generation. It makes for a really moving presentation, and I think it's important, especially at times like these, that we all kind of reevaluate why it is we keep these airplanes flying and why it is we do what we do. So thank you for that reminder. I know it's we've all enjoyed the presentation here.
Thank you.
You mentioned that the airplanes are a catalyst. We've often heard it said they're time machines. I think it's a really interesting comment, because it's certainly a time machine. If you climb in one and go fly it, but you don't even necessarily need that. Seeing the airplanes just there and in the state that they were during the war kind of has that effect as well. Can you maybe speak about some of the experiences you've had on the ramp with the airplane, just with people walking up to it, that are kind of ad hoc, not necessarily things that were particularly organized?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we've had people come up and just shed tears because. So here's my favorite one. This is my favorite one. We had a woman who came up, spent time at the airplane, and then she turned around and just said, "My dad was lost on one of these during the war, and I never got to meet him, but this is the closest I'll ever get to meeting my dad." And that one stands out for us.
Excellent. When you assembled a whole crew basically to go fly again in the airplane, I remember that happening, and it was an incredible accomplishment. We're losing our World War II veterans at a faster and faster rate. Do you think you'd be able to assemble another crew at this time, or have we come too far?
So I think we absolutely have gone too far. Sorry, I was plugging my iPad in here. So that took about 3 months. And we had, I would say, 2 or 3 different times where we had a full crew of 10, and then something would happen. At one point, we had a WASP who was going to be our co-pilot, and she fell and broke a hip. Our second co-pilot died. I don't want to say it's impossible, but I think it would be really, really hard. And our initial goal was to try to find a whole crew that was still alive who flew during the war. And we couldn't do that. That was a full crew, basically a composite crew. That was a real bombardier, navigator, pilot, co-pilot, all the way back to tail gunner. But that wasn't one crew who flew like Memphis Belle or, something like that. So yeah, I have to think it would be pretty hard. I mean, when we pull into an airport before, you'd get maybe, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 World War II vets right away. I mean, as soon as you landed and you pulled in. And now each tour stop, it's tough to even get one during the whole stop that you're there. Like, it's a big deal when they do turn up. I mean, we kind of drop everything. We go over, we try to spend as much time with them. We try to document them with the airplane. It's a really special event. So I would say that no, it's I don't want to say it's impossible, but it would be really hard.
Alrighty, we've got a question here from one of our volunteers. What is it possible for you to assess the number of hours that have been invested in the restoration of the airplane? I know it was a long process over a great span of time, but if you maybe have a sense of how long it took EAA to get the airplane back airworthy, and maybe what some of the major significant milestones were in its restoration.
Well, absolutely. So let me tell you a couple funny stories that go with that. Our airplane was going to be used as a fire ant sprayer. So they installed these big spray bars. And I don't know much about chemicals to spray fire ants. But a lot of the airplanes that were used for like forest fire fighting, one of the big problems is corrosion. The chemicals that are used in the stuff that puts out the forest fires is highly corrosive on the aluminum. So when the airplane was first bought by Dr. Bill Harrison, and this is I want to say early 80s, down in geez, I think it was down in Alabama. He, they basically said, look, the airplane's probably really corroded. It's a rust bucket, I'm sure. Well, it turns out whatever this material was that they were using to spray fire ants was actually a corn-based material, and it actually treated the aluminum in a protective shell. It was not corrosive at all. As a matter of fact, it fought corrosion. And so when they opened up the belly, our airplane was just beautiful. It was like it was brand new. And they took the spray bars and everything off. But Bill Harrison said those early air shows that they went to in the early 80s, when we would pull in and they'd open up doors and stuff like that, that there was corn and stuff that would fall out of the airplane all over the place. I want to say for any B-17, the biggest deal is getting the equipment back in it. I mean, obviously keeping it airworthy is fine, but our airplane was airworthy when we got it. And it's amazing where this stuff will turn up from. For us, a big deal is getting the turrets to work. Our ball turret is fully operational. The top turret is just the dome. We don't have the guts into it. We have the guts for that top turret. But once you start putting it in, it really gets hard to move around the airplane. Now, we talk about flying and static restorations. And this is a prime example of why it shouldn't really be a talk of and, it should be a talk, or it shouldn't be a talk of or, it should be a talk of and. Memphis Belle, that airplane is an actual 25 mission combat vet during a time of the war that was not easy to do. And so that's the airplane. It's not going to fly again. That's the airplane that you put all that stuff back in, all that armor equipment, all the original material, everything like that, because you don't have to worry about getting crews and people and riders around the airplane. Our airplane was produced by Lockheed Vega at the end of the war. Never saw combat. This is the one that we go out, this is one of the type of example you'd want to go out and fly. So that's why we don't have like the top turret in it. We run a different tail wheel on it. So we have the top turret, like I said, just not the interior parts. But it's a great example of an airplane that should be flown and be operated. Now, as far as hours to go into that, let me give you an idea. The airplane comes in at the end of the touring season, which is usually right around Thanksgiving, and comes into our week's hangar every Wednesday and Saturday. We have volunteer times where chapters from around the country actually come and work on the airplane. So think about this: you sign up to volunteer, and you come up here, and you're actually getting dirty on a B-17 or a B-25. Again, I'm not used to talking to folks like yourselves who actually do this, but it's really a special thing to do. But for a lot of people, it's a lifelong dream to get to go turn wrenches on a B-17. It's all done under supervision of full-time staff that's here every day. So basically, we have volunteer hours for the week. However, we also have a full-time crew that's here all year round doing the maintenance on these airplanes. I would put it, and I'm sorry I've given you a really long answer to that, but I mean, I would put it in the thousands of hours as far as restoration hours to get it from where it was as a fire ant sprayer to where it is now. And I couldn't even guess on money. But you're talking thousands of hours to strip the paint back, paint the airplane back how it should be, doing checks on the airplane, wing spar ADs and things like that. And then the equipment, finding this original World War II equipment and putting back, when we got the airplane, there were no bulkheads in it. So when you got back in that waist hatch back by the waist guns, you basically can look straight up into the cockpit. And over the years, of course, we put the bulkheads back in, we put the radio room back, the turret. We have bombs in the bomb bay. We have bomb bay doors that actually work. That was something that we did not have originally. So It's thousands of hours, but it's also ongoing. Right now we're looking at ways to possibly get our chin turret to work. So, it's kind of like a labor of love. Like you have an old Corvette in the garage, you're always tinkering with it. And that's exactly what it is.
Chris, you mentioned that your aircraft was not built by Boeing, but rather by Lockheed Vega. We've
Yeah.
got a question here from William Strasberg. He'd like to know what other airplane companies built B-17s during World War II.
So very interesting. That's a good question. So Boeing, of course, built the 17. They were the first builders. Under the War Act, they were allowed to have other companies build that aircraft. And so Lockheed Vega built our aircraft, and Douglas also built B-17s. So those were the three that were going. Oddly enough, currently right now, unless I'm wrong, there are actually no flying Boeing B-17s. All the B-17s that are flying right now are either Douglas or Vega built. I mean, it's just there's no rhyme or reason to that. It's just dumb luck how that sort of happened. But yeah, and the engines actually were built by different companies. The 1820 radials, Wright was the original builder of the aircraft engine, and then Studebaker came in, and Studebaker built engines as well in Indiana. So it was amazing to see what this. So I know we're in the middle of this, sort of pandemic, if you will, but it was interesting to hear them talk about other places that were going to build respirators and things like that, because it kind of maybe was a little bit of a glimpse of what happened in World War II, where suddenly Ford Motor Company's building Jeeps and B-24s, and refrigerator companies were building combat gliders. You had a car manufacturer, Studebaker, who started building aircraft engines, and it's just amazing to see what this country can do when it's put up to a challenge. And thanks for the question, Bill. Good to hear from you.
So we've got another question here. We'll take a couple more. So if you've got questions, do go ahead and put them in to the question box. How many B-17s are currently flying today? And this is kind of an interesting one. How many more are under restoration with the ambition of ultimately being flown?
Oh, that is a good question. As far as I know, a total number of B-17 airframes that exist in the world is 50, I believe, right now. Of that 50, I believe there's it fluctuates, but I'm going to say there's about 8 that fly. And of the 8 that fly, there's only about 2 or 3 that do the ride, any sort of ride program with the aircraft. And then as far as others that are in line to be restored to fly, there's wonderful work going on with Desert Rat, and that's in Illinois. There's another one in Ohio, the Champagne Lady. I think that's gonna be a flyer, and of course Tom Reilly's working on 2 B-17s, I believe. So there's a possible of another 3 or 4 or 5 B-17s that could fly again. So let's not forget Lacey Lady out in Oregon as well. So that's the one that was on top of a gas station back in the day. Yeah, there's still a few that we could see come and fly again.
And to follow that up, so only a handful really that are out there. We've got a question from Robert Thomas. How many total were built during the war?
So the number fluctuates a little bit, but it's just shy of 13,000. It's like 12,000, I think 731 or 735, but just shy of 13,000. And at the height of production, places like Boeing were putting out like, I want to say it was like 1 a shift is what they were putting out every 8-hour shift. They were putting out a B-17. I mean, that's impressive numbers. That's why they called that the arsenal of democracy. That was literally so a great story I heard, and it's one of those stories that you heard from somebody who told you, but it's gotten down as there was a German tank commander that came to visit a museum here in the United States after the war, and he basically said that our Panzer tank was as good as 10 of your American Shermans. And he says, but you Americans always had 11. And I always loved that story. That was very true, that we just outproduced everything. So.
Okay, and we'll just take a couple more here. We've got a question from William Mullis. You mentioned that there was a place that you kind of routinely visited to search B-17 history records and access pictures. His father flew A-26 Invaders in Korea, and he is wondering if there's a sort of similar historical resource for the Korea era, and if there's some way you could direct him.
Boy, that's a good one. So here's the biggest thing that I've noticed. If you know your father's unit history, check out to see if they have a Facebook page. If you're not on Facebook, easily get with somebody who is, and check that out. It's also worth posting something in the Warbird Information Exchange, which is a good, reliable place to at least get some information. But I got to tell you, the Facebook pages have been amazing. And the neat thing, a lot of times you'll post a picture in one of these Facebook groups. Now I don't know the group that your father was in, but let's make one up. Let's say the 24th bomb group. Okay, check out, see if the 24th bomb group has a Facebook page, and then you post in there who you are and that you're just looking for some information. If you have a photo or two, it doesn't hurt to share it. And what's amazing that I've noticed is not only do you get information, but a lot of times you'll get relatives of people who were on that crew or that knew your dad, and they'll pipe in and start, connecting with you. And it's really amazing. I truly believe this is what Facebook was meant to be for. It was for good. But there really is some amazing things that you can get from that. So if you have that ability, I highly recommend giving that a shot. See if they have a Facebook group or a website. I mean, and they are the ultimate keepers of their history. And a lot of times they'll have some pretty cool stuff that maybe a lot of people didn't know about.
All right, and we got another question from Jacob, who's curious if, in your experience, kind of collecting oral histories and documenting the experience of World War II, if a sense of a particular part of the B-17 that was routinely targeted by the Axis pilots kind of emerged for you.
Yeah. So what we sort of learned, a couple different things. I always thought the ball turret was like this feared position, that nobody in their right mind would want to go down and get in this thing. And what I quickly learned from a lot of ball turret gunners was they liked it. They said there were a couple different reasons. One was they said they had the best view of the whole place down in there, and one said it was one of the warmer positions in the back of the airplane. And one guy told me, look, the whole thing was made out of steel, so I at least had some protection. The fighters would, of course, aim for the front of the aircraft, especially on early B-17s that didn't have the chin turret. As a matter of fact, that's why if you look at like B-17Es and Fs, especially once they start getting into Europe, you see a lot of field mods. You see a lot of guns getting added into places that obviously Boeing didn't do it because it's kind of crude in some places. That's because these guys figured this out and they were adding 50 cal emplacements wherever they could. A lot of them actually aim for the tail as well. Tail gunners took an awful hit. And I want to say statistically, somebody told me that the tail was the most hazardous place. The tail gunner position was not a really fun place to be as far as getting wounded. So to be honest with you, even what they would consider the milk runs or the easy missions, those guys are way braver than I'll ever be. Even going on a milk run, to me, seems incredibly dangerous. You're taking off in bad weather. You have an airplane that's overloaded with fuel and bombs. Just being in that environment is dangerous. You're not even in combat yet. And flak is nasty, nasty stuff. So all those guys, I have a saying that it's a motto that I've taken on, and feel free to steal it. And but I always tell people that we don't realize how cool our grandparents were and how brave they really are. To us, they've always been our grandparents, but in a different light. They did some pretty amazing things. So it's something for us to really be proud of.
I think that's a sentiment that's often echoed around here. I'll pose one last question, as it is now almost 8:30, and we are well and truly over time.
I'm very sorry. I hope I didn't go too long for you guys.
It's not a problem. Thank you very much for still spending this time with us on Q&A.
Yeah.
Do you have any information you can supply on other post-war B-17 uses, like the U.S. Coast Guard rescue missions? We've got a question here from Jamie, who'd like to know the answer.
Just different ways they were used. Yeah. So The B-17 actually soldiered into Korea. A lot of people don't know that a ton, but they were used as rescue airplanes at the very beginning of Korea. And then, of course, once they had the airplanes, like the Albatross, and then eventually the helicopter, the whole SB role wasn't really needed. But the SB-17, or the B-17H, as it was also known, as well as the SB-29. I didn't know that was a thing, but they actually carried boats underneath the B-29. Now, for those that don't know what we're talking about, post-war, actually at the tail end of the war as well, B-17s were modified to carry a lifeboat, and they had this giant metal lifeboat underneath it. In the lifeboat were packed supplies, and they would drop the airplane, drop the boat. There's a big parachute attached to it, and it would kind of make its way down, and you would climb into the boat if you were an airman that was shot down. Funny story I have about that is we had an F-86 pilot here, and he was telling me that he had to bail out, and the rescue crew was so on their game that he said, I was in my parachute floating down, and the boat was actually floating down next to me. And he goes, by the time that I hit the water, the boat was already in the water, and I just swam over to it and got in. So it wasn't like one of those deals where he's out there waiting forever in a raft or in a life preserver. He's like, I remember floating down right next to that boat. But yeah, that's just one role. Of course, the B-17 soldiered on as a fire bomber, putting out forest fires. One little known fact is there was one B-17 that flew in through Vietnam. It was all painted black, and I believe, I don't quote me on this part, but I think it's the same airplane that the Evergreen Air Museum had. And they kind of nicknamed it Shady Lady because it did a bunch of weird CIA missions. But at one point, the airplane was painted black and was in Vietnam. On top of all that, the Navy also used them. They called them PB-1Ws, and that was kind of like an early AWACS, very early AWACS airplane. But they had sort of the big radar domes on them and things like that. Texas Raiders is actually a PB-1W. A lot of folks don't know that, of course, but they weren't produced as that. They were modified into that later. I would think those are probably. I mean, the Air Force did use a lot of weird roles after the war. I mean, unfortunately, eventually they ended up as targets for anti-aircraft missile testing and things like that, which kind of heartbreaking to watch those videos. But yeah, the airplanes certainly soldiered on in the military world, and they even tested it out for an airliner. TWA had two that they ran on a few routes to Europe and then I think to South America. So I don't know why the B-24, which is the most produced American airplane in World War II, it didn't seem to have that longevity, and I don't know why. I don't know what the answer is to that, but the 17 just seemed to find a way to keep living, and the 24s, for whatever reason, they all just kind of went away without fanfare. And it's kind of rare that we only have two Flyers today of the B-24, and that's the most produced American airplane of the war. So but yeah, it's a rugged airplane. The 17 is just it's rugged, and I think the war movies helped. Movies like 12 O'Clock High and The War Lover. Who doesn't love the B-17? I mean, it's the John Wayne of the bomber force, is what I always say.
Well, that's a sentiment that's certainly much appreciated about the B-24. We'll actually be having Brad Pilgrim, formerly of the Commemorative Air Force, and the B-29, B-24 squadron on next Thursday at 7 p.m. to talk to us more about that. Next Tuesday night at 7 p.m., we'll be joined by Dan Jackson, who's an active duty member of the United States Air Force, who'll be talking to us about the air war in China. So definitely some interesting programming coming up. That does conclude tonight's program. But before we send everyone on their merry way, I think Chris is too humble to plug his own book again, so I will do it for him. Chris, the amazing stories you've told us tonight are just a small sampling of the stories and the photos you've cataloged in this book. Tell us again one more time where we can go to get a copy.
Sure, absolutely. The Final Mission, it's available if you go to EAA's website and just go to the merchandise tab. You could pick, select from books and type it in. I think if you Google EAA, The Final Mission, it actually just comes straight to the landing page for the book. And it's a beautiful the book has a really nice sunset shot of the airplane on board or up there, so you won't be able to mistake it. But thank you, and I really appreciate anybody that's out there thinking about it. I appreciate your support. It's nice to know that the work that I and my colleagues did has a place to live, not just on a hard drive, but this book is something that hopefully can get in the hands of some young people and other people that enjoy this and can be inspired by it.
Well, thank you again so very, very much, Chris. You have our gratitude for not just for the work that you've done, but also for spending your time amidst the coronavirus outbreak here with us this evening. So thank you very, very much. And we look forward to the passing of this outbreak and welcoming you back to the Military Aviation Museum in person in the hopefully not too distant future.
I will love it. You name the time and the place, I'll be there.